È un grande onore introdurre il primo speaker internazionale, diciamo che è il padre dell'affective touch, cioè colui che nel tempo ha studiato quelle che sono le caratteristiche dell'affective touch e adesso comincia a renderlo un elemento essenziale all'interno di differenti applicazioni, anche in ambito clinico. So it's my great pleasure to present you. Scusate se parlo un attimo in inglese, giusto per cortesia nei suoi confronti. Nonostante il fatto che insomma spesso viene in Italia e comincia a parlare italiano, vero Francis? Yes. Okay, so it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Francis McGlone from Liverpool University. I met Francis first in London, and we had a great chat regarding the preterms. So his open-minded attitude was extremely thoughtful in terms of generating new ideas. And his open-minded attitude also was the power for setting up a series of studies that we conducted in Milan at the Buzzi Hospital, and he was a kind of the affective touch mentor, so the touch mentor activities throughout these couple of years of studies. So it's my great pleasure. So Francis, the floor is yours. This is the pointer, and that is the presentation.
Thank you very much, Francesco. I'd like to apologise for not speaking English, but if my stupid government and 52% of my country get their way, it will be arrivederci. It's just a frightening prospect that we're facing in the UK, and it's idiotic. I didn't vote for Brexit. Anyway.
Would you mind to speak close?
Can you hear me okay now? Okay. I was just apologising for my government's ridiculous status on this thing called Brexit. Okay, I know all of you sort of use techniques that are more involved in the stimulation of the fascia, muscles, joints, etc. But when I first met Francesco at our first International Association with the Study of Affective Touch meeting, Francesco clearly had recognised that all of these procedures require touch. And this sort of segued very neatly into the research that I've been doing for over 20 years now, is characterising a system of nerve fibres in mammalian skin that basically respond to gentle touch. And I'm going to try and make this argument that this nerve fibre is playing a fundamental role in many aspects of behaviour. I show this video because I always find it really moving, but if you want to control someone, you neglect them. And what this idiot Marxist-Leninist cult leader did in Lambeth in London was basically had locked this girl away from birth and controlled her by denying her touch. She's recording a diary that she wrote when she was 5 or 6 years old, and her memory of how this bastard used to treat her. And just look at the way that he controlled her behaviour by denying her any access to touch. She's Comrade Prem.
October the 8th, 1990. Comrade Bala said about 4 guidelines if Comrade Prem touches anybody. 1. If Comrade Prem touches comrades and tries to hug or hold anybody, especially her, comrades should warn her twice. If she does not stop, comrades have to go to the kitchen and get the stick and beat her. 2. Pull her ears and warn her we will twist them off. 3. He will ask all comrades to join in and poke her. 4. He won't want to ever go anywhere near her, leave alone touch or hug her. And that included my mum. We were not allowed to hug. It was so cruel because it's very painful as well. Sometimes I wanted to have a hug, and sometimes I think how hard it must have been for my mum not to be able to hug me at all.
Now clearly that young lady knows nothing about C-tactile afferents, but we do. And this is the substrate that was not being addressed, that had this impact on her negative emotional experiences. It's a nerve fibre. If we look at the demonisation of touch, I don't know what the situation in Italy is like now, but I recently got in the press by making the statement that children that are not touched and hugged are being abused. We have a paranoid fear in the United Kingdom of paedophilia. Anybody who touches anybody is immediately guilty of some kind of misdiscretion. And that's creating an enormous amount of harm in the way that nursery nurses are told not to touch their children, teachers are told not to touch. You're supposed to hug like that. The whole place has gone silly. And in fact, I got on the BBC News to try and make this statement that not touching people is basically damaging to their mental well-being. And this area, again, what we're talking about now is this nerve fibre that I will be discussing this morning. So if we look at touch, most people think of touch as the experience that you get when somebody touches you or you touch something. And this paper by Gallese and Spence outlines all of the various disciplines that would be involved in understanding the complexity of this media called touch. As a neuroscientist, I'm driven by understanding mechanisms. If we understand a mechanism, we can then better understand the behaviour that's being expressed by any behaviour, quite frankly. And what I'm going to do, hopefully, in this talk is just give you this kind of output. In a system of gentle touch nerves, the view here is that these nerve fibres have an impact on the body's natural healing systems. And I use the word healing in its literal sense here, not in any metaphorical sense. So just a quick review, really, of the skin senses. We know it's our largest sense organ. If you look in any textbook, even today, it will describe the skin senses as touch, temperature, pain, and itch. What we're going to make a case for this morning is that there's a fifth modality, and it is a neurobiological modality. It's not a conscious, affective, top-level, top-down effect. There is a nerve fibre that sits with these others that encodes aspects of touch to the body. So we know a fair amount about the characteristics of many of these touch receptors in terms of their ability to detect all these situations that you see here, largely driven by myelinated nerves. And there's an important distinction here before we go much further, is the difference between a myelinated nerve and an unmyelinated nerve. Myelin evolved later in evolutionary time. The first nerve fibres to evolve were C fibres. C fibres are unmyelinated. Now, the difference between a myelinated and unmyelinated nerve fibre is primarily conduction velocity. A fast-conducting myelinated nerve fibre, if you touch yourself, someone touches you, you feel it instantaneously. Although it may take 80 or 90 milliseconds to get to your brain, you're not aware of any distinction. However, if a C fibre is stimulated, it can take a second or two for that information to get to the brain. So this is a key indicator that the C tactile afferent that we're describing this morning cannot serve any primary sensory function. Okay? Myelinated nerves serve sensory function. They tell you that a fly has landed on you or somebody's touched you. You need to respond immediately. The C fibre cannot do that because its information gets to the brain very slowly. So the anatomy tells us something about what this nerve fibre must be doing. It is not processing immediate information. And in fact, all of these C fibres project into emotional or affect processing parts of the brain, and all of you will experience that if you've ever burnt your finger. That's a C nociceptor that's giving that information into the central nervous system. So just to summarise, we've got the skin senses, the discriminative. We know a reasonable amount about the wiring diagram into primary somatosensory cortex. The second stage here is the emotional system, and most of the literature that's looked at C fibres in terms of affective state have focused on C nociceptors. Traditionally, these C fibres are associated with pain and with itch. What we're going to look at is again the C fibre that doesn't respond to nociceptive stimuli, but to gentle touch. And again, this is just to highlight the distinction between a myelinated and an unmyelinated nerve. These images here just give you some indication of just how fast this transmission is. So the A beta touch nerves will fire at the speed of a Formula 1 racing car. The C fibres just go at a slow walking pace. So that's just an analogy so you can see the distinction between these two nerve fibres. I want to make another sort of comment here in terms of why C fibres evolved in the first place. And they basically protect. So one interesting characterization, one way to look at C fibers is they evolved a role in protection. So the C nociceptor clearly is there to protect. And it drives a whole range of behaviors that basically describe that protection. What I'm making a case for is the C tactile, we can call it a hedonous receptor. And that also protects, and it drives a different kind of behavior to that would be activated by a nociceptor, where we see these kind of behaviors here of approach and nurture. And again, these two nerve fibers are basically providing a primary role in the development of a nervous system. No matter what that animal is, it needs to protect itself. And the C nociceptor is classic. So there are rare cases of children who are born with a congenital absence of C nociceptors. And an example I always cite is this little girl used to like jumping off a high table because she liked the popping noise in her knees. Now, if you don't have C nociceptors, you'll put your hand in boiling water and you won't even know about it. So everybody can grasp how important that C fibre is. I'm making a case that the C tactile afferent plays as an important fundamental role in the developing social brain. Now, these things, I suppose, in neuroscience history are not that old. The first recognition of a low threshold mechanosensitive C fibre in mammals was discovered by Zosserman in the 1930s, where he was recording from the saphenous nerve in a cat, and he rubbed across the receptive field. These are read from right to left, and he noted, as one would have expected, fast conducted myelinated impulses in direct response to the stroking touch. But he had the good presence of mind to sit looking at this trace and found that a couple of seconds later he got these inputs coming down that nerve fibre that was clearly from a C fibre, and they were clearly responding to that gentle stroking touch. These nerve fibres were subsequently discovered over the ensuing decades in these various animals, but they were thought to be vestigial, if at all present, in human primates. Until again, the wonderful Swedes come along, and this is clearly one of my heroes, Orca Valbo, who set me on this trajectory 20 years ago when I read his paper, having developed this wonderful technique of microneurography, where you're able to put a very fine tungsten microelectrode, a bit like an acupuncture needle, but much finer, through the skin into an underlying nerve bundle, and thereby you can, with a lot of patience and years of skill, you can tap into the activity in any one of these sensory nerves that innervate the skin. Now this nerve bundle, this nerve fibre could be connected to a touch receptor, a pain receptor, an itch receptor, but it was with this technique that Noreen and Valbo and others discovered a C fibre that responded specifically to gentle touch. And that was the beginning of a whole series of experiments that basically helped to characterise the properties of this nerve fibre that responded to touch. This is me being recorded from a low threshold mechanoreceptor. So we built this robot to do the stroking. And here you'll see when a receptive field is activated with the brush. So that's touch as far as your brain knows it. These are spikes generated by stroking touch, and it was this technique that enabled us to characterise the properties of the C tactile afferent. Just a few pointers about what this nerve fibre responds to. Here we have 3 recordings from a C tactile afferent in a human, 3 tactile indentations. And if this was a fast myelinated nerve, all of these spikes would be aligned with the tactile stimulus. They're not, there's a delay, so this is clearly a C fibre. The conduction velocity of these nerve fibres over a period of 10 or 15 years was characterised by Orca and Johann Vestberg, and clearly they are fit into the taxonomy of a C fibre. They respond at about a metre per second. Their force sensitivity is not within the nociceptive range. When these were first discovered, there was a lot of sort of objections to the fact that this is just another nociceptor. Well, it isn't. These nerve fibres respond exquisitely to the most gentle touch of the skin surface. This slide here basically helps you get some sense of how these 2 touch systems work. We have a fast one and we have a slow one. The recording on the left is from a fast myelinated nerve fibre. Whenever the receptive field is touched, you'll hear the nerve fire. And here we see a recording from a C tactile. Notice from that, by the way, which is quite important, is that there's a distinction between how that nerve responded to a fast and a slow touch. It really fires off more energetically to a slow, gentle touch. So remember that, chaps. This is just a graphic which describes this system now in a more sort of illustrious way, really. So you're stroking the skin, you get the fast nerve firing off, but you also get this gentle. I won't go through the whole of this movie, but the distinction here is whenever you are touched, the fast touch nerves are firing, but the slow touch nerves are also being activated. So the brain is separating these two inputs out. I won't ask you to touch the next person next to you, but when someone touches you, you immediately feel the touch. But depending on context, and I must impress that context clearly matters, something else wafts in when you've had a hug or someone touches you on the shoulder. That's the C fibre input, processing that gentle touch and sending it into the central nervous system. So, what's the functional role of a CT? They're not suitable for discriminative touch, slow conduction velocity, variable responses from trial to trial when we record from them, and the other important distinction that drives our interpretation of what these nerve fibres are for is we've never found them in glabrous skin, okay? They are not here. Now, if you think about the anatomy driving function, you wouldn't want an affective, cuddling nerve fibre here, yeah? The glabrous skin clearly is all about the outside world, yeah? It's exploring objects, it's feeding things, it's exploring the outside world. This, hairy skin, which is the rest of your body, is me, yeah? So the CTs are only in hairy skin, and this is why that self-soothing goes on. You've got a surface that doesn't have CTs, stroking a surface that does have CTs. There's an interesting paradox there in terms of self-touch, which I think is reassuring. You know, you've got a tool here with no CTs, stroking a skin site with CTs, so ponder that one. So they're not nociceptors. Many years of research has gone into characterising that fact. So let's just step back a bit and say, well, in evolutionary space, why would a system like this evolve? Well, one area that we've been looking at, of course, is social grooming in primates. This study done by Barry Cavern in Oxford many years ago basically took a colony of grooming colobus monkeys, I think, and just looked at their grooming activity, i.e. how much they touched each other. So one population was given an opiate blocker, naltrexone. The other was giving a non-sedative dose of opiate, so they weren't out of their heads in any way. These were natural doses. The group that had the naltrexone opiate blocker upped the amount of grooming they did. Now we can make a correlation here now that the opiates are driving some aspects of the reward associated with affective touch. And opiates play a role in many aspects of affective behaviour, from nociception to hedonoception. So this is an example. Now, Barry Cavern knew nothing about the C tactile afferent, by the way, but he's making a point here that there's something about grooming behaviour which is rewarding. If things aren't rewarding, we don't do them. Yeah, it's a basic evolutionary principle. Yeah, animals will do things that are associated with a reward, and they'll move away things that are associated with a punishment. These examples here, again, I'm just building an argument here. You know, nobody knows the CT exists, let's say, at this stage, but these observations have been made over the years about how aspects of interactive social touch have these various impacts on behaviour. This one I particularly like because the French are so touchy. And this was comparing French teenagers with American teenagers, which may not surprise some of you. The Americans are far more aggressive and the French just like to kiss each other. There's nothing wrong with that. Another sort of indication that there's something about touch was Harlow's famous experiment. Now Harlow knew nothing about the C tactile afferent, But he recognized that when an infant monkey is removed from its mother at birth and given the option of either a wire surrogate that had a reward associated with it, i.e. food, or a cloth surrogate that had no obvious reward with it, the monkey would cling to this 98% of the time. Of course, I would interpret this behaviour as C-tactile. There's an instinctive reward associated with care and cuddling this surrogate mother from this infant. Another really exciting step that's come around in the last 10 years is this area of epigenetics. These were studies that were initially done by McGlone and Sif. Now, he initially had no recognition that this was driven by a C-tactile afferent, but he made these observations that if you're the unfortunate pup from a mother that does not lick and groom you very much, all of these downstream consequences will affect your behaviour for the rest of your life. You will be stressed out, basically. And the epigenetic markers show very clearly the expression of glucocorticoids within the hippocampus and other regulatory mechanisms are basically running on red alert. And the only link to that state of that adult brain is whether you were from a high licking and grooming mother or a low licking and grooming mother. And again, we see a role for this nerve fibre in shaping the destiny of that developing brain. And we can take this even further in terms of human studies, and this is what we were aiming to do with Francesco and Luca and the neonatal intensive care studies, was to try and put some science into this now in the NICU. All of these effects are subsequent to, we would infer the relationship between gentle touch in the early stages of brain development. And all of these markers aren't some kind of psycho-nonsense. They're absolutely measurable consequences of lack of affective touch in the early stages of development. I always like to go back in evolutionary time, and although this link may not be absolutely clear, if you take C. elegans, and C. elegans is the only animal on this planet that they've worked out the full connectome for. That took 12 years, by the way. If they think they're going to work out the connectome for the human brain in my lifetime or anybody else's, I'm a wee bit suspicious. So anyway, if you grow C. elegans from an egg in a colony, it grows to its normal length in a period of a few days. However, if you take it and put that egg in isolation, it hardly grows. Now, what this animal is not getting is touch. If you tap the Petri dish and give a mechanical stimulus, it may grow a little bit longer. This animal, out of its 302 neurons, has 6 that respond to gentle touch. So it matters to us. Touch has been found to be particularly important in a whole range of behaviours. And again, all of this stuff has been out there in developmental neuroscience and psychology, but largely without an explanation of why these effects are found. And what the argument I'm making this morning is it all points down to a single nerve fibre that's evolved to respond to gentle touch. This guy makes me laugh because this is the era that I grew up in. I can't remember being cuddled and hugged by my mum, which is probably why I'm such a mess. But this guy was basically telling parents not to touch their children because it may make them mawkish, which I think is brilliant. There's another move now, of course, where we've gone completely the other way, where cuddling and hugging is de rigueur, so is the way forward for nurturing care. What I want to do now, just for the next few slides, is just how do you, once you say there's a pleasant touch system there in the skin, you need to measure it. And the first study that I think was done on this was a colleague of mine, Greg Essick in North Carolina, was working on how the brain decodes tactile motion, i.e. how the brain knows that something's moving across the skin. And Greg had built a rotary motor that basically stroked a brush up and down across the skin at different velocities. So we took this device, we stroked it across the face or the forearm at 3 different velocities, and basically we just asked participants to rate how pleasant that touch was. Now we used 3 surfaces, but don't worry, those 3 surfaces are not really that relevant, by the way. Here's our 3 velocities, and here's a visual analog scale with which the participant would rank how pleasant that touch was. And here we see the first emergence of a tuning curve. all these participants would rate the stimulus that's moving at 5 centimetres per second as far more pleasant than fast and slow. And again, look at an interesting topography difference here. When that same stimulus was moved across the face, there was a significantly higher reporting of how pleasant that stimulus is. And those of you who know about the somatosensory homunculus in the brain know that that homunculus is derived by the number of receptors in different body parts. So there's more finger and lip representation in primary somatosensory cortex because there's more receptors here. We're making an argument here that there's more of these gentle nerve fibers here than there are here. We published a paper recently that basically described the hedonic homunculus as opposed to the sensory homunculus. So we can boil this all down now, this sort of 20 years of research, where we take our robot, we carry out our microneurography experiments. This was done in Sweden. And here we're stroking across the receptive field of a C-tactile unit that has been recorded with microneurography, and we're looking at the activity of that neuron. And what do we find? We find that that neuron is optimally active at round about 3 to 5 centimetres per second. Stroke faster and stroke slower, and the nerve fibre is not as interested. If these are these fast myelinated nerve fibres, they respond like this. The faster you stroke, the more they fire. If we now take our robot and just do the psychophysics experiment, and we ask people to rate how pleasant these different velocities are, we get exactly the same function. So the first order neuron is agreeing with the perception of affective touch stroking. And that correlation is almost perfect. And that really is the basis of the CT pleasant touch hypothesis. One other interesting characteristic of this nerve fibre, which again fits its role as, if you like, the cuddle neuron, is that when we, and this was done by Rochelle Ackerley again in Gothenburg, when you stroke the skin at different temperatures now, that C-tactile afferent is most active at skin temperature. So when you're laying your hands on somebody, this C-tactile afferent will not respond optimally to a skin temperature that's higher than the skin or lower than the skin. It fires optimally to skin temperature. Now that, in terms of nurturing care, couldn't have evolved in a more positive way. These are just experiments that are going on now in monkeys, rats, and we're hoping to do this again in humans, is look at this epigenetic process, look at the effect that gene by environment interactions shape the destiny of that developing brain and its ability to withstand stress. Neglect is the worst thing that you can possibly do to a developing child, as we've seen with the Romanian orphanage babies. So we propose that C-tactile afferents play a significant role in shaping the developing brain. I won't go into too much more detail, I think, because all of these slides really just are other indicators that neglect affects the way the brain develops. This is myelinization in the prefrontal cortex. Social isolation damages the way that myelin is actually developed, so this is obviously cognitive processes. A paper by Fairhurst recently described stroking touch as having a direct effect on parasympathetic nerve activity, i.e. relaxation. My own sort of pet theory for 20 odd years is that this system basically underpins many of the developmental consequences that we see with autism. And just to wrap up, so in our lab we have a whole range of approaches that we're using to try and tease apart how we can characterise the functional properties of these nerve fibres. And one I'll end on, which is quite published a couple of months ago actually. This is a study I did with Rebecca Slater in Oxford. She developed a technique where she was recording event-related potentials from the brain of an infant, a term infant, in response to a heel lance clinical procedure. So they developed a measure of nociception in term infants. And obviously you can't ask a baby if it's in pain. You can look at its face or you can look at some reflex activity. But this is the response that we got to stroking the leg very gently at 3 centimetres per second before the heel lance, and that evoked potential in response to pain is attenuated. So these two nerve fibres, these two protectors, the C-tactile afferent and the C nociceptor, clearly talk to each other somewhere. So if you gently stroke the leg of an infant, prior to a nociceptive stimulus, the response and cortex to that nociceptive stimulus is significantly attenuated. If we stroke the leg at 30 centimeters per second, which is outside the bandwidth of the C-tactile afferent, that response doesn't happen. So this is clearly an indication that what we've done is activate the C-tactile afferent. The other thing, just to sort of wrap up in terms of at the other end of the spectrum from term babies, loneliness is now a growing problem in the West in particular. And this was a wonderful series of data from John Cacioppo, who was looking at the number of people that are living on their own from 1950 to 1970 to 2000. More and more people are basically living in isolation. And John Cacioppo has this rather terrifying data. The odds ratio, i.e. the link between an event and a cause of an early death, all right, an odds ratio of you dying before your time is 5, 20 or 30% for these conditions. Guess what it is for loneliness? And I'll leave you with one question. What don't lonely people get? The study in the BBC recently ran in the UK didn't even ask that question. Yeah? My view is that lonely people don't get enough touch. There's a devastating consequence on their mental well-being and their longevity. And again, we come back to this little nerve fibre. It's a big ask that that nerve fibre should provide so many consequences to our survival. But my view is that it is the culprit. And I'll just end, we've got a wire in, all this stuff's published. I encourage you, by the way, if you can, to come to our third international meeting, which will this year be held in Linköping in Sweden. And we have published a book if you want to know more about the neurobiology. So thank you for your attention, and I hope you understood some of this.